Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jennifer Blank. This is a PowerPoint video presentation on Unit Number 7, The Presidency of Andrew Jackson, Manifest Destiny in the Age of Reform. The years that we will cover will be 1828 to 1860. So, special note, this PowerPoint does not contain all of the required information for this unit. Many key ideas will appear in class, in my Nomia lessons, and on the video lessons for this PowerPoint. So the key ideas that I'm going to talk about in this series of 3 PowerPoints, Part 1 is about Jacksonian democracy, Part 2 is about manifest destiny and westward expansion, and Part 3 is about the various reform movements of the 1800s. So this is Part 1, Jacksonian democracy. For my students who are joining me, I'm going to go through several review slides that I had from our previous unit from Unit 6. So I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly. If you need more of a refresher, please feel free to rewatch some of those video lessons. So we're going to start with the election of 1824 because you need some background to really understand Andrew Jackson. So you had 4 key candidates, and these are the 4 listed there. And this was a big battle in 1824. All right, just to give you some background on the candidates, I'm not going to spend too much time on John Quincy Adams, but Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson we need to focus on because those two are going to make a very important resurgence in this unit. So Henry Clay was a very skillful negotiator. He worked out several important compromises, the most notable of which was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. We should all know all about that, very important. Jackson was a military hero, okay? He made his name during the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. He was a landowner and a slave owner, but he grew up poor, so he was seen as a man of the people, and he definitely used this to his advantage. So the election of 1828 resulted in what Jackson called a corrupt bargain. Because there was no clear winner from the Electoral College in that election, and Jackson won the popular vote, there was a compromise that had to be made. He did not win a majority of the electoral vote, so he could not be named president. So we had to engage in a compromise of sorts. So the House of Representatives, as per the Constitution, chose the winner. Clay finished third, so he was out. But he urged people to vote for Adams. He said Adams should be president. So as a thank you, Adams said, hey, Clay, I really appreciate you helping me out. I'm going to make you Secretary of State. And Jackson deemed this the corrupt bargain. But what was done was what the Constitution had in mind. It's what the Constitution prescribed. So no foul play was really had here. With the election of Andrew Jackson, his nickname was Old Hickory, he was a hero of the common man. And he loses in 1824, but why does he win in 1828? Well, the right to vote was expanded to way more citizens, so he was able to get more people involved and win the Electoral College. In 1824, there were 350,000 white males voting. In 1828, there were over 1 million. That's a big difference. So this is what propelled Jackson to victory in that election. Now, Quincy didn't help himself out, John Quincy Adams. He was all about economic growth, so he wanted internal improvements, and he encouraged projects that promoted the arts and sciences. But so many Americans objected to it because they thought it gave the government too much power. Jackson was the opposite. He wanted the federal government to have more limited power. He wanted states to have more power in this regard. So he was able to use this unpopularity of Adams to his advantage and win in 1828. Now, the American system is very important. I'm going to pause here because this is key. This was developed by Henry Clay. It was adopted by President Adams, and there were 3 key parts. The development or redevelopment of a national bank. This is the second national bank. You have the development of protective tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. So the idea is that you make imports so expensive that people don't buy those. They don't buy goods from other countries. They buy domestic. They buy what we produce in our own country. He also wanted nationally funded infrastructure, a series of roads, canals, and railroads to connect both people and stuff, to make the shipping of people and things more efficient and make the economy work better. So this is what the American system was all about. Very important. So the bitter campaign of 1828 was a problem. So you have Adams against Jackson again. The campaign was not a focus on issues. It was instead a focus on personality. Jackson said that Adams was stuck up. He was a member of the upper class. Supporters of Adams said Jackson was a military chieftain. He would become a dictator just like Napoleon. You shouldn't vote for him. That was partially true. Jackson did kind of exercise some dictatorial powers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So, now that I've given you some background, I want to give you some big picture ideas. This was a time of growing sectionalism. It's very important that this division of power that federalism sets up between the national government and several states created a power struggle. Okay, that's what sectionalism is. It's who should have more power, the states or the national government. His election, Jackson's election, ushered in this new era of popular democracy. This is when we began using the term democracy instead of republic. Our founders always referred to our nation as the republic. Now you see every politician running around like a crazy person. Democracy this, democracy that. Well, this started during the age of Jackson. Jackson won this election easily, and his election showed the growth of democracy during this period. So his political philosophy was based on granting political power to the common people, and part of how he tried to achieve this was through the spoils system. He hired his own supporters to replace the previous administration's staff, believing that they would be in line with his personal philosophy. He gave away many jobs to friends and political allies, and this garnered him a lot of support. He gained a lot of support this way. At this point, parties were organized locally as well as at the state and national levels. Political patronage or favors were used to maintain party loyalty and candidate loyalty as well. They did all kinds of fun stuff to mobilize voters. You can see the list of things that occurred. Candidates needed to be folks that other people could relate to. You know, they were folksy, they drank, they fought, they were military heroes, and things like that. So people could connect with their candidates and made them more likely to vote for them. You also have the use of partisan newspapers, one-sided newspapers that shared information and rallied people to go vote, and you had much higher voter turnouts during this period. So now let's talk about a couple key events that happened during Jackson's presidency. This thing called the Bank War. I'm going to give a lot more details about this in my Nomia lesson on Nomia.com, but this is the big picture. He opposed the National Bank because it was a part of Henry Clay's American system, and he didn't like Henry Clay, remember? So, and he created pet banks to compete with the idea of a national bank. And these were called pet banks because Jackson favored them. Many people felt he was acting more like a king than a president, as depicted in the political cartoon on the left. And in 1832, his opponents formed a new party called the Whigs. Now we have a surge of third parties getting involved here, and that's the Whigs. The Whigs are going to be very important for the next several elections. I'll have more details about this in the Nomia lesson. Moving on, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was Jackson's key policy relating to the Native Americans. He proposed it, and then Congress passed it with his support and major prodding in 1830. Under this law, federal government was allowed to forcibly relocate Indian tribes west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee tribe in Georgia sued to maintain their lands. The Supreme Court upheld it, but Jackson ignored it. So he refused to abide by it, and he was quoted as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it," because of course the Supreme Court can't do anything unless the executive branch enforces its ruling. The Trail of Tears followed, and U.S. troops rounded up the Cherokee and other Native American tribes and drove them west. They were mostly on foot. Thousands died. It was a 2,200-mile trek. I have a great deal more details about this in my Nomia lesson. But here's a map, a visual for you, just so you can get a sense of where these native tribes were coming from and where they wound up. This area over here is so-called the Oklahoma Territory, and that's where the Indians were relocated to. So we have this Tariff Abomination, which is really important. In 1824 and 1828, Congress increased the import tariff of 1816. Southerners called this tariff a Tariff Abomination, and all their economic problems that they were dealing with were blamed on this tariff specifically because it favored the North, who engaged in a lot of trade and things like that, and it actually did penalize the South economically because of all of their dealings with Britain and with cotton and whatnot. So it was the South was very, very unhappy with this tariff. Because of this, John Calhoun, who was Jackson's VP at the time, proposed this idea of nullification. Now, you should remember this. This should be somewhat familiar because of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. They originally proposed this idea in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions to combat the Alien and Sedition Acts. But Calhoun gets credit because he really solidified the theory, and it became more of an issue when he proposed it in the way that he put it forth. So John Calhoun gets credit, but I always like to pop in Madison and Jefferson should get some credit too. He believed that if a state found an act of Congress to be unconstitutional, it could just not enforce it. It could declare it void and not even deal with it. The tensions were only relieved because Henry Clay swoops in and saves the day with his compromise tariff in 1833. So now you have the Panic of 1837 moving forward. Martin Van Buren, poor guy, he inherited all the problems from the bank wars. Because Jackson's pet banks were printing money without gold backing, this caused a great deal of inflation, massive economic problems. So in 1837, a panic set in, banks closed, accounts went bankrupt, unemployment soared. Martin Van Buren was blamed for all of this. Nobody blamed Jackson. So here, I shouldn't say nobody blamed Jackson. There were a few people who did. Here's a political cartoon depicting Jackson in all his glory. So Jackson is seated in a collapsing chair with the altar of reform toppling next to him and rats scurrying at his feet. The rats are Secretary of War, Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of State, and Treasury Secretary. Jackson's spectacles are pushed up over his forehead, and his foot is planted firmly on the tail of the Van Buren rat. Resignations fill the air behind him, and a pillar marked public confidence in the stability of this administration falls to the left. So I want you to think about what this political cartoon might signify. We're going to talk about this in class. So conclusions about Jackson. He was contradictory. He was both authoritarian and democratic. He expanded the authority of the executive by linking it with the idea that the president was the direct representative of the people. This is an idea that we still believe in this country right now to this day. The president is the point man. He's the front man for the government, and that's who we look to. Through the Trail of Tears, the National Bank issue, and the nullification crisis, all of these things were issues that Jackson used to expand the authority of the executive, to maintain the security of the Union. He did decrease authority of the national government, though, by reducing the impact of the American system and by proclaiming that he wanted a frugal and limited federal government. So he was a bit contradictory. In the presidential election of 1840, Martin Van Buren runs again, but he is not going to win this one. He just can't recover from the panic of 1837. William Henry Harrison, as a Whig, he's running. He was another war hero, so people were he was very popular with a lot of folks. A lot of people backed his presidency. And then John Tyler was the candidate for vice president under Henry Harrison. He was also a military hero. So Harrison and Tyler defeat Van Buren. No surprise, everybody blamed him for the panic. Harrison was known as Tippecanoe for a battle he won against natives. He died a month into his term because the idiot decided he was going to give his inaugural address in the cold with no jacket. Well, he caught pneumonia and died a month later. Idiot. Wear a coat for Pete's sake. You know, it's the middle of January in D.C. It's not exactly warm up there. His vice president, John Tyler, would inherit the presidency, and Harrison wasn't really around long enough to do very much. So in the election of 1844, I'm bringing this up because this is going to be really important for part 2 of our PowerPoint video lessons. James K. Polk ran as a Democrat. He was known as Young Hickory because he was a protege of Jackson. So remember, Jackson was known as Old Hickory. That was his nickname. Well, now we have Young Hickory. This gentleman, James K. Polk, was pro-slavery and pro-expansionism. He was against the American system, and his nickname was also, at least by historians, was Mr. Manifest Destiny. Henry Clay, running again, poor guy, he created and proposed the American system. Polk ended up winning, and after he won, he very quickly annexed Texas. Sectionalist tensions come to the forefront as westward expansion continues. So I wanted to wrap this up because I want to show how James K. Polk really kind of continued some of Jackson's policies into his presidency, and what James K. Polk does as president is going to have a significant impact on the future of the United States. So, key ideas from part 1, the key terms we learned about. We learned about Andrew Jackson, very briefly the Trail of Tears, James K. Polk, the American system, the Tariff of Abominations, the Bank of the United States, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. So I hope you learned what you need to. This is now the end of part 1, and I will see you next time.